The full crew finally mustered numbered 892, but this number can vary from account to account. Of these, 73 were in the deck department, 325 in the engine department, and 494 in the steward's department. Also included in this department, strangely, were the two telegraphists, John or Jack Phillips, who was the senior operator, and Harold Bride, the junior. These two men didn't work for White Star at all. They were employed by Marconi. Yet they did have to sign the ship's papers, indicating that they were under Captain Smith's command as junior officers. During the Titanic's trials and her voyage to Southampton, Phillips and Bride, who were both in their early 20s, had been working hard, tuning in their powerful wireless equipment and transmitting many messages back and forth to the owners and the builders. During the day, the wireless equipment on the Titanic would have had a range of about 350 to 400 miles. At night, this would be much increased to well over 1,000 miles. Lastly, the 8 bandsmen who sailed with the ship were also not employees of White Star, and neither did they sign the ship's articles. They were employed by a firm of musical directors based in Liverpool, who supplied orchestras for many of the lines. Captain Maurice H. Clark, a nautical surveyor and the Board of Trade Assistant Immigration Officer and Inspector, was the last person who could have possibly prevented the forthcoming disaster by stopping the Titanic leaving Southampton on the 10th of April. His job was to supplement and complete the inspections carried out by his Belfast colleague Francis Carruthers. For this, he visited the ship 3 times during her stay in Southampton, the last being on the day of her departure, when he took the whole morning going over her. Clark checked the accommodation, boats and crew, assisted by a medical officer. As an immigration officer, he must have spent a considerable amount of time in the bowels of the ship, where the third-class or steerage accommodation was situated. It's surprising, therefore, that Clark never found or was told about the fire that had been raging for a week in Coal Bunker 10 in Boiler Room 6. If he had, he would surely have insisted that it be extinguished before the ship left Southampton, thus saving her from a far worse fate than just missing her scheduled departure time. But it was not to be. The last thing Clark ordered Captain Smith to have done before he signed the clearance certificate was to have 2 boats swung out, lowered, rowed round the dock, and hauled back. Once this was done to his satisfaction, he wished the captain good luck, goodbye, and left the ship. Just after 9:30 a.m., the White Star Line boat train for second and third-class passengers arrived in Southampton from London's Waterloo Station. It steamed slowly through Terminus Station and across the Canute Road, while the traffic, still mainly horse-drawn, was held up. It finally came to a halt beside a platform that ran parallel with the ocean dock, where Titanic was waiting. As the passengers left the train and made their way through the sheds towards the quay, most were to see for the first time the massive proportions of the White Star Line's new flagship. Grey smoke curled gently into the air in plumes from 3 of her 4 tall yellow funnels with their broad black collars. Her white upperworks and immense black hull dwarfed every other ship in the port. The stars and stripes were flying from her yellow foremast, indicating the final destination of her maiden voyage was the United States. The blue ensign flew from her yardarm, and the White Star house flag from her mainmast. Slowly the passengers started to board the great ship. Second class, as was the practice at the time, had their own separate entrances onto sea deck, while the third-class entrances were much further forward or aft. First-class passengers also had their own entrances, which would, of course, keep them separate and aloof from the other classes. At the head of the gangway for steerage passengers, a doctor quickly scrutinized each person before allowing them on board. American immigration laws were strict, and anybody showing any sign of infection in the brief seconds allocated for each examination was immediately sent back ashore. The accommodation on board the Titanic for the third-class passengers was on D, E, F and G decks in the forward and after sections of the ship. The only way steerage passengers could pass between these areas was on E deck. Here a long corridor ran the entire length of the ship and was called Park Lane by the officers and Scotland Road by the crew. Of the 497 steerage or third-class passengers that boarded in Southampton, 183 were British, and of these, 19 were members of just 2 families. These were the Goodwins, Fred and his wife Augusta, travelling with their 6 children, one just a baby, and the Sage family, John and Annie, with their 9 children. They were all looking forward to a new life in America. Many of the other nationalities represented in the third class were from Scandinavia, names such as Andersson, Asplund, Hagland, Hansen, Jonsson, Skog, and Svensson being prominent on the passenger list. One of the 277 second-class passengers to travel on the ship was Mrs. Henry B. Cassibier, a young widow yet an experienced traveller. She knew that often in the off-season the more expensive cabins were not always full, and for the cost of a few pounds slipped to a purser, she would be able to upgrade herself to first. This she was able to do, and later when she met the chief purser, Herbert McElroy, again, she asked with a grin if he could find her a place at the captain's table. "I'll do better than that," he replied with a wide smile. "I'll have you seated at my table." Mrs. Cassibier was to live to tell this story. Herbert McElroy was lost with the ship. Another second-class passenger who boarded the ship in Southampton was Lawrence Beasley, who was going to America to tour. He survived the disaster and wrote a book recounting his experiences. The night before the Titanic sailed, he wrote, he had spent in a hotel near the dock. From there, in the morning, as he ate breakfast, he was able to see the Titanic's huge elliptical funnels high above the roofs of dock buildings. He was also able to watch the long procession of stewards, stokers, and other members of the crew making their way into the dock to take up their positions on the ship. Behind him, at another table, sat 3 people who, he could tell from their conversation, were also going to travel on the ship. They were discussing the coming voyage, and estimating, among other things, the probabilities of an accident at sea. Beasley wrote that he saw them again later on board, but they were not among those who were saved. Thomas Andrews, the managing director of Harland & Wolff, was also staying in a hotel the night before Titanic sailed. Not a modest one like Beasley, but the grand Southwestern Hotel. Andrews had sailed over with the Titanic from Belfast with 8 assistants, and they were all shipping with her as the builder's guarantee group. It was their job to make final adjustments to the ship and sort out any teething troubles that might occur on the crossing. Andrews had been closely involved with the Titanic from the design stage right through her construction, and in Southampton he'd worked for long hours making sure nothing was overlooked in making her ready for sea. On the 9th of April, he wrote to Lord Pirrie, his uncle, "The Titanic is now about complete, and will, I think, do the old firm credit tomorrow when we sail." On the morning of the 10th, Andrews went aboard the ship at 6:30 a.m. and spent 6 hours making his final inspection. Once he was satisfied that he could do no more, he said goodbye to his secretary, reminding her to keep his wife informed of any news from the ship. Andrews and his 8 colleagues were all to perish. J. Bruce Ismay also stayed at the Southwestern Hotel with his family. On the morning of the 10th, he took his wife and 3 children on an extensive tour of the ship before they left him on board and went off for a motoring holiday in the western counties. During their tour, they went deep inside the huge vessel, visiting the Turkish baths, squash rackets court, and swimming pool on G-deck, as well as viewing the gymnasium and miniature golf course on the boat deck. As the Ismays made their inspection of the ship, more and more passengers were coming on board who were also keen to explore what delights their floating home had to offer for the next few days. None were disappointed. Never before had there been a ship so well appointed, not even the Olympic, although she came close. Ismay was a handsome man with piercing eyes and short curly hair, which was swept back. He wore a moustache, which, as was the fashion at the time, was slightly turned up in military style. At over 6 feet tall and of sturdy build, he was always extremely well turned out. Among those he employed, he bore the reputation for being inflexible in the running of his business affairs. His word was law. Deviation from this was not tolerated. By his peers, he was seen as a shrewd and extremely able businessman. It's more likely that he was respected rather than liked. Ismay was to survive the disaster, but not with any dignity. As the minutes ticked by, the deep growl of the ship's siren could be heard across the port to let everybody know, as if there was anybody in Southampton that didn't, that the Titanic was soon to sail. The stewards were busy carrying luggage and directing passengers to their cabins, while the deck crew and ship's officers had no time to waste as they carried out their duties. All the ship's corridors, lifts, and stairways were alive with excited passengers, their visitors, and crew, as the last hours slipped by before Titanic cast off. In the 6 huge boiler rooms, the black gang shoveled coal into the furnaces. Not all were lit yet. More would be added as the voyage went on and speed was increased. The fire in the coal bunker in No. 6 boiler room was still burning, but it had been left for the time being. Nobody then realized it was weakening the bulkhead between No. 6 and No. 5, and this would shorten the ship's life after she struck the iceberg. At 11 o'clock, just over an hour before Titanic was to sail, the second boat train from London Waterloo arrived at the dock. This train carried the first-class passengers, many of whom were American. Prominent Americans tended to prefer the White Star Line, probably because they were aware of its American antecedents. The British tended to lean more towards Cunard. On board this train were Colonel John Jacob Astor, 47, with his child bride, 18-year-old Madeline Force. Astor owned a large part of Manhattan, plus a large quantity of the most squalid slums in New York. His wealth was estimated to be in excess of £30 million. He was going home, after escaping to Europe for some months after the scandal his divorce and new marriage had caused. Benjamin Guggenheim had also travelled down on the train with his beautiful mistress. He was the head of a family whose fortune was spread in mining, metals, and machinery. His own personal fortune was estimated at £20 million. The elderly Mr. and Mrs. Isidor Strauss were also on board. They were returning from a winter holiday on the Riviera. Strauss had emigrated to the United States and made a fortune in commerce and banking. He was also a partner in the world's largest department store, Macy's. His fortune was estimated at £10 million. Also on board were Mr. and Mrs. George Widner. Widner was the son of P.A.B. Widner, the tramway magnate. He too was estimated to be worth £10 million. Major Archibald Butt, the military aide to President Taft, was travelling with his friend Francis Millet, the well-known artist and author. Millet had served as a drummer boy in the American Civil War. He had come a long way since then. Another soldier on board was Colonel Archibald Gracie, who was an amateur historian, wrote a book about the campaign in the American Civil War called The Truth About Chickamauga. As these passengers took up possession of their cabins or suites in Millionaire's Row and started to settle in with the help of their stewards, the ship's siren was heard again, its deep growl letting friends and visitors know it was time to go ashore, as the gangways would soon be withdrawn. At Captain Smith's orders, the quartermaster on the bridge pulled the lanyard for the second and third time, and the growl from Titanic's triple-valve siren vibrated through the Southampton air, blotting out momentarily the conversation of all those nearby. Flying from the halyard was the red and white Trinity House pilot's flag, which fluttered in the breeze. George Bowyer, the pilot, had come on board early that morning to get ready. A maiden voyage was an exciting event, and Bowyer didn't want any mistakes. Bowyer was the pilot that had been with Smith on the bridge of the Olympic when it was rammed by HMS Hawke. From the foremast of the Titanic, the Blue Peter was flying, indicating the ship was about to leave. Captain Smith had had a busy morning, making sure Titanic and her crew were ready for sea. He had also to deal with all the necessary paperwork that needed his attention, which included preparing the formal master's report to the owners, which read, "I herewith report this ship loaded and ready for sea. The engines and boilers are in good order for the voyage, and all charts and sailing directions up to date. Your obedient servant, Edward J. Smith." On the forecastle head were the chief officer in charge of moorings, with the second officer to assist him and see to the springs. Aft were the first and third officers with the same duties. The fourth officer was on the bridge and was to work the telegraph in accordance with the pilot's and Captain Smith's orders. The fifth officer, also on the bridge, was in charge of telephones. Lastly, the sixth officer was in charge of the gangway, seeing it safely lowered after all the visitors had gone ashore. Just as he was about to give the order, 8 crewmen ran along the quay clutching their belongings. 2 managed to scramble aboard, but the rest were refused permission to pass despite their pleading. Among the 6 refused permission to board that morning were 3 brothers, who a few days later must have been very happy indeed that they'd had one drink too many the night before, or whatever else it was that might have delayed them. "Gangway lowered," was reported to the bridge. To make sure that everything was in order, Captain Smith walked to the port wing of the bridge and looked along the quay. All was clear. "Make fast the tugs." The fifth officer repeated the pilot's order down the telephone to the officers fore and aft. "Tugs are all fast," was soon reported back. "Let go all lines." And the immense hawsers splashed into the water and were quickly drawn ashore by the pierhead gang. "They're off! She's off!" was the cheer from the quay as the Leviathan started to move. Hats were raised as friends and families alike waved goodbye to one another with a smile and a tear. Many were saying goodbye for the last time, as the gap between Titanic and the quay began to widen. On the ship, the passengers could feel the vibration through the decks from the huge engines that were beginning to turn over, but she was not yet under her own power. 5 tugs from the Red Funnel line were straining to move her towards the dock's entrance. The crowd on the quay slowly moved along the dock, keeping pace with the Titanic as she was slowly towed towards the river. They were still cheering and waving. On board, the band was playing cheerful music, which was barely heard above the commotion. "Let go your after tug," ordered the pilot. At the dock entrance, the Titanic began her turn, in a newly dredged turning circle, to face down the River Test. Here, the rest of the tugs were cast off, as the order was given, "Slow ahead." Titanic was soon under her own power, and the bow started to cut its way through the water as the ship slowly began to pick up speed, causing a great turbulence in the river as her propellers cut into the water. Tied up at berth number 38 was the liner Oceanic. Doubled up alongside her was the New York. Both ships were still temporarily out of service because of the coal strike. On the New York, a crowd had gathered to get a better view of the Titanic leaving port, and as she passed them, they waved and cheered gleefully, their warm goodbyes being acknowledged heartily by the crowd still lining the rails of the Titanic. The well-wishers on the New York suddenly began to feel their ship heaving and vibrating as the liner began to pull hard against her moorings, which eventually snapped under the strain with a loud crack, sending the broken ends of the heavy ropes flying dangerously into the air. Soon the New York's stern was being dragged round towards the Titanic's side by the huge suction that had been built up between the two ships. Lawrence Beasley, who was aboard the Titanic, wrote, "On the New York there was shouting of orders, sailors running to and fro, playing out ropes and putting mats over the side where it seemed likely we should collide. The tug, which a few minutes before cast off from the bows of the Titanic, came up and around our stern, and passed to the quayside of the New York stern, made fast to her, and started to haul her back with all the force her engines were capable of. But it didn't seem that the tug made much impression on the New York. Apart from the serious nature of the accident, it made an irresistibly comic picture to see the huge vessel drifting down the dock with the snorting tug at its heels, for all the world like a small boy dragging a diminutive puppy down the road with its teeth locked on a piece of rope. At first, all appearance showed that the sterns of the two vessels would collide. But from the stern bridge of the Titanic, an officer directing operations stopped us dead. The suction ceased, and the New York, with her tug trailing behind, moved obliquely down the dock, her stern gliding along the side of the Titanic some few yards away. But all the excitement was not over yet. The New York turned her bows inward toward the quay, her stern swinging just clear of and passing in front of our bows, and moved slowly head-on for the Teutonic, lying moored to the side. Mats were quickly got out, and so deadened the force of the collision, which, from where we were, seemed to be too slight to cause any damage. As the Titanic got under way once more, Beasley noticed that as the ship passed the Teutonic, she also heeled over several degrees under the strain of suction, pulling hard at her moorings, but fortunately they didn't give, and as the Titanic passed, the Teutonic swung slowly back to her normal station. Beasley had also been fascinated, as he watched the incident, with the way the officers and crew on the Titanic had behaved, and the way little red and white flags were hauled up and lowered, as the danger of collision alternately threatened and diminished. How malicious then can fate be, to nearly bring about an accident that might have caused the minor inconvenience of a brief delay to the Titanic's sailing, and yet such a mishap could have saved the loss of about 1,500 lives. The incident did save one passenger, however. This story was told by Mrs. Harris, wife of the American impresario. She was approached by an unknown gentleman soon after the event who said, "This is a bad omen. Do you love life?" "I love it," replied Mrs. Harris. "And get off this ship at Cherbourg if we get that far. That's what I'm going to do." Mrs. Harris laughed, but she didn't see the man again, so she guessed he carried out his intention. On the bridge, the officers breathed a sigh of relief as they steamed down Southampton Water, for they all knew what a lucky escape they had just had. But they had been delayed by an hour by the episode, and that was not a good start. As the Titanic sailed into the Solent, the engines were slowed for her to make the difficult turn round Colshot Spit. She then sailed along the Thorn Channel and round the West Bramble Buoy. Straightening her course, she sailed down the channel to Spithead, where she dipped her ensign to some Royal Navy destroyers, then onto the Nab light vessel, where the pilot, George Bowyer, disembarked. After Bowyer had made his way down the Jacob's Ladder and stepped aboard the pilot boat, the engine telegraph signalled full speed ahead, and the Titanic got under way again, heading towards the French coast not 70 miles away. The tricolour flew from her foremast as the Titanic gained speed. In the first-class dining saloon, the orchestra played as the passengers sat down for lunch. On the deck, the stewards were putting out chairs. Some passengers still stood at the ship's rails, watching the English coastline as it faded into the distance. Others were exploring the endless corridors and companionways on the decks open to them, which depended on which class they were travelling. To help them, there was a little guidebook supplied by the company to assist passengers find their way around. Second Officer Charles Lightoller was in his cabin on the boat deck when one of the lookouts, George Simons, knocked on the door. "What is it, Simons?" asked Lightoller. "We have no lookout glasses in the crow's nest," Simons replied. Lightoller said he would look into it and went to see the first officer, William Murdoch, who said he knew all about the problem and would deal with it. The outcome was that no glasses were found, and the lookouts had to go on duty without them. The missing binoculars were probably to be found in Lightoller's own cabin, which had been David Blair's when he was second officer. On the voyage over from Belfast, Blair had issued binoculars to the Crow's Nest lookouts, and on the ship's arrival in Southampton, he had asked for them to be returned and placed them in a locker in his cabin. With the reshuffle of the senior officers, Lightoller, now stepped down to second, was unaware where the glasses had been stored. Were the missing glasses another contributory factor as to why the iceberg was not seen by the lookouts until the last moment? Frederick Fleet claimed at the inquiries that had he had glasses, he would have seen the iceberg a lot sooner. One can only speculate on what would have happened if he had. The sun was sinking in the west as the French coast came into sight. Titanic had been due to arrive at Cherbourg at 4 o'clock, but by the time she dropped anchor in the roadstead, it was nearer 6. At Cherbourg, Titanic was to pick up another 274 passengers, all of whom had arrived on the boat train from Paris. There were 142 first-class passengers, 30 second, and 102 third. As Cherbourg's harbour was too small for the Titanic to dock, the passengers had to be ferried to the ship by 2 tenders, Nomadic and Traffic, specially built for the White Star Line to serve the Olympics. The first and second-class passengers sailed out to Titanic in the Nomadic, while the third-class passengers, mail and cargo, travelled out on the Traffic. Neither ship was a quarter full. As the season on the Riviera was nearly over, many more prominent passengers were to join the ship. These included Mrs. Charlotte Drake Cardiza and her son Thomas of Philadelphia, who were accompanied by Mr. Cardiza's valet and a maid, plus 14 trunks, 4 suitcases and 3 crates of luggage. The Cardizas were booked into Suite B51, a 3-room complex, with its own promenade on B deck. In the White Star brochure, the price for this suite, for one voyage only, was £890. It may have been Mrs. Cardiza, or possibly another lady travelling first class, with an equally large quantity of luggage that said, "I had in my cabin jewels worth £4,000, as well as many trunks of dresses and hats. One does not come from Paris and buy one's clothes in America. That is understood, is it not?" Another couple on board were Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon, who had booked into separate cabins under the assumed name of Morgan. Lady Duff Gordon was a well-known dress designer who founded the fashionable dressmaking firm Madame Lucille, with branches in London, Paris and New York, and a staff of over 1,000. Accompanying her was her secretary, Miss Laura Francatelli. Booked into second-class cabin was Baron von Drachstedt, who, once he arrived on board, complained that he was not satisfied with his cabin and moved up to first class, probably slipping the purser a few francs. Later in New York it was revealed that von Drachstedt was not a baron at all. His real name was Alfred Nonne. Among the third-class passengers were many Syrian, Croatian, Armenian and other Middle Eastern nationals who had great difficulty when they came aboard trying to understand the instructions they were given by the stewards, who were endeavouring to get them settled into cabins. To transfer the passengers, their luggage, mail and freight from the Nomadic and the Traffic onto the Titanic only took 90 minutes, and the tenders were ready to return to harbour. Waiting to return with them were the many French newspapermen who had come aboard to be shown how luxurious the Titanic really was, not an easy thing to do during such a brief stay, as there was so much to see. Also going ashore were 15 first-class passengers and 7 from the second class, plus a little freight, including 4 cycles and a canary. Titanic was once more ready to sail. Her siren was sounded 3 times before the anchor was hauled up by the windlass gear and her engines began to drive the brightly lit ship forward in a tight turn to put her on course for Queenstown, County Cork, her last destination before New York. The Titanic passed through the Grande Rade, and slowly the lights of Cherbourg disappeared into the distance. By this time, most of the passengers, except for the recent arrivals on board from Cherbourg, had made themselves at home. Some were seated for dinner or drinking coffee and liqueurs, idly chatting with other passengers, renewing old friendships or making new ones. The ship's orchestra played on A deck for those that wanted to listen or dance. The smoking rooms were full as the passengers gathered round in small groups, exchanging stories or playing games. Beneath their feet was always the powerful throb of the Titanic's engines, hardly noticeable once the passengers got used to it, but always there. Some of the passengers commented that the ship was so steady it was like being on land. Later, as the crowds began to disperse from the public rooms, it was time for the stewards to start work. Titanic must be ready in the morning, clean and tidy, for the passengers to sit down to breakfast. White Star's high standards of personal service had to be maintained on this, their new flagship, especially on her maiden voyage, with so many prominent millionaires on board, for their recommendation of the Titanic to their friends was worth a great deal to White Star. As the night drew on, Titanic steamed across the lower reaches of St. George's Channel and into the Irish Sea, the great V of her wake disappearing into the darkness behind her. Then, in a brilliant sunrise, the ship began to make wide, sweeping turns to allow her officers to make some final adjustments to the compass. After passing the Daunt light vessel, Titanic stopped for a few minutes to pick up the Irish pilot, who was to guide her as she slowly steamed through the heads and round the low-lying Roches Point with its lighthouse and signal towers. A sounding line was being dropped continuously as she approached the harbour. There was not much water below her keel. She came to a stop rather suddenly, well out to sea, when her screws started churning up the bottom, turning the sea brown with sand. She was about 2 miles from the harbour when she lowered her anchor, and prepared to take on board more passengers, mail and freight. Huge crowds stood on the headlands on either side of the entrance to Cork Harbour, watching Titanic's arrival. From here, they had a good view of the 2 White Star tenders, Ireland and America, as they steamed out to meet the liner, their side wheels dipping deep into the sea, driving the little ships forward. It took them about half an hour to make the journey. As they came alongside Titanic, they were dwarfed by the huge size of the ship as she rode gently on the slight swell. The gangways were quickly attached, and the passengers slowly made their way on board. There were 130 in all, 123 third class and 7 second. There were also 1,385 sacks of mail. Newspapermen, too, had travelled out as they had in Cherbourg. The White Star Line always liked to entertain the press, and they were shown quickly over the ship, rushed from deck to deck in the lifts. After their tour, members of the crew posed politely so that photographs could be taken. Captain Smith was also persuaded to take part, and the photographers snapped away busily. For a prank, one of the black gang, probably a stoker, climbed up the ladder inside the fourth dummy funnel. When he popped his blackened face over the top, he must have shouted or made some other noise, for it seems a lot of the passengers saw him before he dug down again. Some thought it was a huge laugh, but many of the passengers saw it as a bad omen. One American lady went so far as to attribute the loss of the ship to this apparition. Along with the tenders, plenty of bumboats had also sailed out to Titanic, their owners coming on board with goods to sell to the passengers. These included such things as Irish linen and laces. J.J. Astor bought his wife a beautiful lace shawl, costing $800, from one of these peddlers, and this story was widely reported in the Irish press over the next few days. Most of the passengers who went on board that bright afternoon were emigrants, travelling steerage, many of them young men and women hoping to make a new and better life for themselves in North America. It was said of the harbour, "Queenstown is a wound that Ireland cannot staunch, and from it pours a constant stream of her best and her youngest blood." It's true that Ireland had very little to offer her young at the time, but it's sad to say that when many of these poor young hopefuls got to Canada or America, they found there was little difference. J. Bruce Ismay, who ostensibly was travelling only as a passenger, took the opportunity while the ship was anchored to talk privately to the chief engineer, Joseph Bell, who had been transferred to Titanic from Olympic. Ismay told Bell that he hoped to drive the ship at full speed on Monday or Tuesday. As yet, all the boilers were not lit. By then, it was expected they would be. It may have been Ismay's idea that Titanic should try and beat the Olympics crossing time in the hope of grabbing more publicity in the newspapers. Whatever his idea was, he didn't share it with Captain Smith. In the master's quarters, behind the bridge, E.J. Sharp, the local immigration officer, was with Captain Smith. He countersigned the Report of Survey of an Emigrant Ship, issued by Carruthers in Belfast, and issued the last clearance certificate giving the official total of those on board. This was 892 for the crew and 1,316 for the passengers, a grand total of 2,208. The true number on board was never known, as the amount varied between Sharp's report and the White Star list. One man whom Sharp had counted, who was definitely not on the ship, was 24-year-old John Coffey, who had deserted and slipped onto one of the tenders, hiding himself under some mail bags. Coffey had signed on as a fireman in Southampton. He was not an inexperienced or a lazy seaman, for it's known that he'd served on the Olympic, so why did he desert? There has been much speculation as to his reasons in the many accounts of the Titanic story, some saying he had premonitions of disaster. The truth is that Coffey, who was born in Queenstown, had been living in Southampton for some time, and had signed on with Titanic for a free ride home to see his family. He didn't stay long in Queenstown, though. A few days later he signed on board the Mauritania. He was never heard of again, though many have tried to trace him. Once all the mail had been transferred from the tenders to the Titanic, both ships sounded their whistles to let the shore visitors and passengers who were disembarking know that they were about to leave. Titanic's siren too joined in the chorus. As it was blown 3 times, its sound reverberating in echoes from the nearby hills. As soon as the gangways were hauled up and the tenders had cast off, the straining windlass pulled up the great anchor. On the bridge, the jangle of the telegraph could be heard as orders were sent down to the engine room for slow ahead. In answer, her screws slowly started to turn, churning up the sand below her keel as she went into a turn. By then the tenders and the bumboats were well clear, making their way back to harbour, their passengers standing at the rails watching Titanic as she headed back out to sea. Now the stars and stripes flew from the foremast, indicating her next port of call was the United States. On her mainmast flew the White Star Line pennant, and on the stern flagstaff fluttered the blue ensign. At the light vessel, her engines were stopped for a few minutes while the pilot disembarked. She was soon under way again, making a long turn to starboard, until she was steering westward along the Irish coast towards the Fastnet Rock, and then out into the Atlantic. A great number of seagulls escorted Titanic as she left Queenstown. They hovered and dipped around her for many hours, waiting for scraps that might be cast overboard. Eventually, they left her to sail on alone, while they went off to scavenge elsewhere. On the evening that Titanic had left Southampton, the captain of the French liner Niagara reported by wireless that he was stopped and damaged following a collision with ice. The Niagara was sailing north of the Titanic's planned route, but nevertheless it was a definite warning of possible hazards ahead. In fact, it was common knowledge among seafarers that the winter in the North Atlantic had been the mildest for more than 30 years, causing more ice to be carved or broken away from the glacier in the huge Disco Bay in Greenland. There had been many reports from ships of huge fields of sheet and floe ice, with icebergs and growlers amongst it, drifting further south than normal across the east-west shipping lanes. Another contributory factor was an unusual geophysical quirk that year. The normally warm Gulf Stream, which flows eastward across the Atlantic to northern Europe, melting the ice as it drifted southward, was itself sighted much further south than normal. Captain Smith had planned that Titanic should sail on the standard summer westbound course, agreed by all the major shipping companies in 1899. This outward southern track, as it was known, started at the Fastnet or Bishop Rock off the south coast of Ireland, and followed on the Great Circle to position 42 north, 47 west, called the Corner. There the course would change according to the prevailing current to arrive at a position south of the Nantucket light vessel, then on to Fire Island light vessel, and so into New York. This route between the 15th of January and the 15th of August was generally far enough south to be clear of any danger of ice, and there had only been 3 occasions since 1898 when any significant quantities of ice had affected shipping on this track. In April 1912, it happened again. Titanic was steaming towards a long finger of ice stretching straight across her course. By 12 o'clock on Friday the 12th, after 22 hours steaming from Queenstown, Titanic had logged 386 miles. Still not all of her boilers had been lit, and even though extra men had been taken on in Southampton to fight it, the coal bunker fire in number 6 boiler room was still burning. At 7 o'clock, in the busy Marconi office, the operator received the first ice warning from the French liner La Touraine. My position, 7 p.m. GMT, latitude 4928, longitude 2628. Dense fog since this night. Crossed thick ice field, latitude 4458, longitude 5040 Paris. Saw another ice field and 2 icebergs, latitude 4520, longitude 4909 Paris. Saw a derelict, latitude 4056, longitude 6838 Paris. Please give me position. Best regards and bon voyage, Cousin. Paris, given after the position sent by La Touraine, meant they were not navigating to Greenwich, but to the French capital, and the difference in longitude had to be calculated to get the exact positions. Captain Smith was given this message, and he sent back a reply offering his thanks to Captain Cousin, and including Titanic's position at 7 p.m. Soon after this message was sent, the transmitter started to go wrong. It took Phillips and Bride 6 hours to trace the fault, which turned out to be a short circuit where the leads to the transformer secondary had burnt through inside the casing and were making contact with the bolt securing the frame. After binding the damaged leads with insulating tape, the transmitter started to work again satisfactorily. By 12 noon on Saturday, the 13th of April, Titanic had logged 519 sea miles over the past 24 hours. This information was pinned up on the notice boards for the passengers' information. It was a popular sport on board ships to try and guess the distance that would be covered over a 24-hour period, and much money was sometimes gambled on the outcome. On board Titanic, there were no formal activities or parties arranged by the company. The passengers were left to make their own entertainment in their public rooms or in their own cabins, while they waited for the bugle which was blown to announce each meal. Cards were a popular pastime on board ships, and much money often changed hands as the passengers whiled away the time. This, of course, attracted the professional gamblers that frequented the shipping routes. Passengers were warned about these sportsmen by an insert that was printed in the passenger list, but that was about as far as it went. The company didn't want to imply any sort of responsibility for passengers' losses. On the Titanic, there were at least 3 well-known card shops, all travelling under assumed names. Listed as George Brayton was George Boy Bradley. C. Polmain was in truth C.H. Romaine, and E. Harvern was Harry Kid Homer. They were, it seems, very lucky indeed, for they all survived. It's also believed that J. Yates, another professional gambler, was on board, using the alias J.H. Rogers, although neither of these names appeared on the passenger list. Yates or Rogers gave a note to a passenger waiting to leave in a lifeboat which eventually found its way to his sister. From Boiler Room number 6, that Saturday evening, there was some good news for Captain Smith. The 10-day-old fire had at last been put out by the stokers and the extra gang of 12 men hired in Southampton. Thomas Andrews, leading the Harland and Wolff Guarantee Party, went down at once to inspect the damage. He found that the fire had darkened and warped watertight bulkhead number 5, where it had been red-hot for days. This would have made the metal brittle, and after the collision, the bulkhead did give way prematurely, probably because of this weakness, shortening the ship's life even more. As the sun rose above the horizon on Sunday the 14th, the sea was calm, and the clouds that stretched in layers across the deep red and yellow sky were being blown in a westerly direction by a fresh wind. It was beginning to get cold, and not many of the passengers braved walking or sitting on the decks. Most stayed in the public areas or in their cabins. From early morning, the gymnasium, squash court and swimming pool were busy, as were the libraries for the less energetic. The bugle was sounded for breakfast, which was served for all classes between 8:30 a.m. and 10:30. Not many passengers missed their meals, and the stewards were kept busy. At 9:30 a.m. in the Marconi office, the first ice warning of the day was received from the Cunard liner Caronia, sailing eastbound from New York to Liverpool. It read, Captain Titanic. Westbound steamers report bergs, growlers, and ice field in 42 north from 49 to 50 west. April 12th, compliments, Bar. This message was given to Captain Smith, who was on the bridge. After reading its contents, he posted it for his officers to see. The ice reported in the message relayed by the Caronia was only a few miles to the north of the Titanic's course. But as the report itself was 2 days old, the ice could have drifted a lot further south since then. By all accounts, Captain Smith showed no sign of apprehension on reading this news, nor did any of the other officers, and the ship sped on at 21.5 knots. Captain Smith was now aware that Bruce Ismay wanted to see how fast the Titanic could go on a high-speed run. With the remaining fuel available, this could only be for a few hours, but nevertheless, Smith ordered that preparation should be made to light the remaining 5 of Titanic's 29 boilers. For some reason, Captain Smith didn't carry out his normal daily inspection of the ship that Sunday. Also, lifeboat drill was cancelled, ostensibly because of the cold wind. After breakfast, a service was held in the first-class dining saloon, led by Captain Smith. The White Star Line provided its own prayer book for this purpose, and the ship's orchestra supplied the music for the hymns. The service went on for about 3/4 of an hour, and finished with, O God our help in ages past. In the Marconi office, the telegraphist on duty was busy sending or receiving personal messages for the passengers, or logging and transmitting the ship's business. At 11:40 a.m., another ice report was received, this time from the Noordam, relayed to the Titanic by the Caronia. It read, Congratulations on new command. Had moderate westerly winds, fine weather, no fog. Much ice reported at latitude 4224 to 4245, and longitude 4945, and longitude 4950 to 50-20. Again, this report placed the ice a little to the north of Titanic's course. Teacups and glasses clinked in the smoking rooms and lounges as people sat and gossiped or told stories, as the Titanic forged on ever westward. Some of the passengers just sat and watched the sea go by, while others read books or magazines or wrote letters, while the more energetic enjoyed a swim, a game of squash, or were exercising in the gym. Luncheon will be served between 1 p.m. and 2:30. A rumour was circulating in the second-class public rooms that one of the female passengers was sitting up all night through fear that something would happen to the Titanic. She had apparently woken her husband the previous night, convinced the ship had hit something, and sent him to find out what had happened. The officer whom he approached wanted to know why he thought that anything was wrong, and when he said his wife had heard a strange sound, the officer admitted that the ship had run through a field of pack ice, but there was nothing to worry about. This encounter with ice was not mentioned in any of the official reports, but was quoted in the biography of Miss Eva Hart, MBE JP, who was on the ship as a child of 7. She and her mother escaped in a boat. Her father perished. At 1:40 p.m., another ice warning was given to Smith. It originated from the White Star liner Baltic, a ship which Smith had once commanded. It read, "Captain Smith, Titanic, have had moderate variable winds and clear fine weather since leaving. Greek steamer Athenia reports passing icebergs and large quantities of field ice today at latitude 4151 north, longitude 4952 west. Wish you and Titanic all success. Commander." This report put the ice very close to Titanic's course. In fact, it was very near to the actual position at which Titanic struck. Shortly after receiving the message from the Baltic, Jack Phillips, the senior telegraphist, received another warning from the German liner America. It was addressed to the United States Navy Hydrographic Office in Washington, D.C., and read, "Passed 2 large icebergs in 4127 north, 58 west, on the 14th of April. This report was the first to put the ice south of the Titanic's course. With this, and the other reports received that day, it indicated that the ship could be heading straight for a huge field of ice spread right across her path. Titanic's telegraphist relayed this message on to other ships, as was the custom, but as it was not addressed to the Titanic directly, it was not given to the captain or any of the officers, and was probably spiked. This was an alarming mistake, and illustrates that no proper system for the handling of messages important to the ship's navigation had been organized between the telegraphists and the captain. Telegraphists were not navigators, and Phillips probably had no idea of the importance of the message he'd received. He had been very busy since leaving Southampton, and pressure of work may well have contributed to this oversight. That afternoon, Captain Smith was just as guilty of indiscretion as the telegraphists. He was handed the ice report from the Baltic just as he was about to leave the bridge for luncheon with Ismay. After reading the note, he put the message in his pocket and, without showing it to anybody, went to the dining saloon. Later he gave the report to Ismay, explaining that the ship might soon be encountering ice. Ismay kept the only copy of this message, putting it in his pocket. Later he showed it to some of the passengers. Smith was not to ask for the report back until after 7, when, at this late hour, he posted it in the chart room. Whether or not any of the other officers saw it is doubtful. As the afternoon went by, the sun was still shining, but it had become very cold, and the decks were deserted. At 5:50 p.m., Chief Officer Wilde was on duty on the bridge, when the time came to alter course for Sandy Hook at the corner, or turning point, latitude 42 north, longitude 47 west. In fact, the ship had sailed on for half an hour longer than normal before turning, on Captain Smith's instruction in the night order book. This delay was perhaps in order to put Titanic further south of the ice reported in the messages Smith had received earlier that day, but half an hour would have made little difference under the circumstances. Second Officer Lightoller relieved Wilde at 6 p.m. and the 6th officer, James Moody, came on watch at 8. On White Star Line ships, senior officers, that is, the chief, first and second, did 4 hours on and 8 hours off. The junior officers did 4 hours on and 4 hours off. They would also stand the dog watches, altered every day. The captain, with no set duty, was to be available at any time. Also at 6 o'clock, Hogg and Evans, who were on duty in the Crow's Nest, were relieved by Jewell and Simons. There were still no binoculars for the lookouts. Hogg said as he started to reach for the ladder inside the mast, "Nothing doing? Just keep a lookout for small ice." The first-class passengers who had changed into evening dress started to make their way towards their tables in the dining saloon or the à la carte restaurant. The stewards were ready for a busy evening. The weather was still good, so most of the passengers would want to dine. In the other saloons, too, second-class and steerage passengers were preparing for their evening meal, and afterwards perhaps a sing-song or a game of cards. In the second-class saloon, the purser and one of the passengers, Reverend Carter, had organized an evening of hymn-singing. Over 100 people turned up and enjoyed the music until 10 o'clock, when tea and biscuits were served. When 5th Officer Lowe came on duty at 6 p.m., there was a chit of paper on the chart-room table with the word ice penciled on it. Below that, there was a position. Lowe quickly worked out in his head that the ship would not reach that position during his watch, so he put it out of his mind. It was the general opinion of the officers that the Titanic would be up with the ice between 10 p.m. and midnight. At 7:15 p.m., Samuel Hemming, a lamp trimmer, reported to the first officer on the bridge that all the lights had been placed. He was just leaving when Murdoch called him back, pointing forward, saying, "Hemming, when you go forward, get the fore-scuttle hatch closed. There's a glow left from that. And as we're in the vicinity of ice, I want everything dark before the bridge." Hemming closed the hatch himself on his way back to his quarters. At 7:30 p.m., another ice report was picked up by the Marconi office. Again, it was not for the Titanic, but this time it was taken to the bridge. It read, "Californian to Captain, Antillean. 6:30 p.m., apparent ship's time. Latitude 42.3 north, longitude 49.9 west. 3 large bergs 5 miles to the southward of us." Again, this report placed icebergs very close to Titanic's course, but their position was not plotted on the chart, and the report was not given to the captain, who was dining with the passengers. By then, too, another warning of danger was recorded on the bridge. The temperature had dropped 5 points in the last half hour to 39 degrees Fahrenheit. It would soon be freezing. As the evening wore on and the weather got continually colder, the work on the bridge carried on as normal. The officer of the watch took a set of stars, 3 for latitude and 3 for longitude, while a junior officer worked out the slip table. This would enable him to gauge accurately the miles per hour the ship was traveling, so that at 8 o'clock he will be able to work out the ship's position by dead reckoning. At 9:40 p.m. in the Marconi office, Phillips received the following message from the Mesaba, another westbound liner. "To Titanic and eastbound ships. Ice reported in latitude 42 north to 41.25 north, longitude 49 west to 50.30 west. Saw much heavy pack ice and a great number of icebergs. Also field ice. Weather good, clear." Phillips, who was working alone at the quay, Bride by then having turned in for a rest, didn't take this message to the bridge either. He was working the wireless station at Cape Race, which was just in range, and he had a pile of personal messages from the passengers to send. He didn't realize that the report that he had just put aside from Mesaba warned of ice directly across Titanic's path. He merely sent to the ship's operator, "Received, thanks," and began transmitting to Cape Race again. Second Officer Lightoller was later to place a great deal of significance on Phillips' thoughtlessness in not bringing this message to the bridge, even to imply that the disaster may not have occurred if he had done so. At 10 p.m., the 2 lookouts in the Crow's Nest were relieved. and Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee began their vigil in the freezing cold. On the bridge, First Officer Murdoch took over from Lightoller, who went off on his rounds. This involved walking over a mile of decks and climbing hundreds of feet of ladders and companionways. Once he had finished, he went to his cabin for some well-deserved sleep. At 10:30 p.m., the dark shadow of a ship was seen approaching from the west. It was the British cargo steamer Rappahannock. She had recently emerged from a great ice field in which she had sustained severe damage to her rudder. As she drew closer, she began to signal with a Morse lamp to ask Titanic to identify herself. Her master then sent the following signal: "Have just passed through heavy field ice and several icebergs." After a brief time, the Titanic signaled back, "Message received, thanks, good night." This final warning confirmed that there was ice just a few miles ahead of Titanic, yet Murdoch, as officer of the watch, did not tell the captain, and let the Titanic speed on at 22.5 knots. It may seem absurd with hindsight that the Titanic's speed was not reduced, but at the time it was common practice for Atlantic liners to maintain full speed unless there was a clear danger. When ice was about, for example, speed was maintained to clear the area as quickly as possible. Even in dense fog and quite blind, ships were still driven at full speed to keep up with their schedules. A punctual and reliable ship was a good ship. Passengers liked punctuality, and captains that could get them to their destinations on time were popular and profitable for their lines. Some miles ahead, and to the north of the Titanic, was the Leyland ship Californian, a 6,223-ton cargo liner. On watch on her bridge was her captain, Stanley Lord, and third officer, Charles V. Groves. At 10:21 p.m., Groves suddenly saw white patches in the water dead ahead. It looked to him like a school of porpoises crossing the ship's bow. Captain Lord knew better, and was already signalling full speed astern to the engine room on the telegraph. He had been warned to expect ice, and here it was. Quickly the Californian lost way. As she did, Lord ordered her helm to be swung hard to port, to bring her round to the northeasterly heading before she stopped. Soon she lay still in the water, her engines on standby. The weather was clear and cold, and the sea a flat calm. Lord could not see any icebergs, but it wasn't long before the vessel became completely surrounded by flat pieces of field ice drifting southward. Lord had no idea how far it stretched, or how thick it might be. He had never been in ice before, and was not about to take any chances. He decided to stay where he was for the night, and try to steam out of it in the daylight. After taking one last look around, Lord left the bridge, leaving instructions that if anything was sighted, he was to be called at once. At around 11 p.m., Groves saw the lights of a steamer in the distance coming up fast from the southeast. As she grew closer, he guessed it was a large passenger ship. On the deck below, Captain Lord was watching her too. He asked his wireless operator, 21-year-old Cyril Evans, who only had 6 months' experience, "What ships are nearby?" "Only the Titanic," Evans replied. Lord then asked Evans to warn her that the Californian was stopped and surrounded by ice. On the Titanic, Phillips was working through the backlog of passengers' messages when he was nearly deafened by the blast of Evans' signal from the Californian just a few miles away. "I say, old man, we're stopped, surrounded by ice." Evans got no further than that before Phillips blasted back, shut up, I'm busy. I'm working Cape Race." He then returned to sending personal messages.